The ocean was supposed to take them. 5 golden retrievers, trained for silence, locked in a rusted steel box and left to drift into nothingness. No food, no water, no hope. But fate doesn't always follow orders, and neither do those who still believe in second chances. When Jack Marlowe cracked open that container, he didn't just rescue 5 dying animals. He uncovered a forgotten chapter of war, betrayal, and an unbreakable kind of loyalty that machines were never meant to understand. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments and if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you? Please give this video a like and consider subscribing. It was late October in Kachemak Bay, a windswept inlet on the southern edge of Alaska. The sky was leaden with storm clouds, and gusts of icy wind swept across the choppy water, rattling the ropes and rusted pulleys of the Marlowe family's old patrol boat, the St. Mary, once a Coast Guard utility vessel. It had been stripped of its insignia and repurposed by Jack Marlowe, now 52 gaunt, with a short, graying beard and calloused hands that bore the story of 3 decades at sea. Jack was a man built like driftwood, weathered, lean, and silent. His dark eyes seemed to carry a distant storm, shaped by years of war and, more recently, the loss of his son, an oil rig worker who died during an explosion in the Gulf. The tragedy left Jack with full custody of his granddaughter, Emma, a situation he met with stoic resolve and very few words. Emma Marlowe, 10 years old, was a slender, pale girl with freckles dusted across her nose like snowflakes. Her thick brown hair was always tucked into the hood of her oversized coat, her green eyes cautious yet observant. Since her parents' death, she'd withdrawn into a shell of quiet defiance, rarely speaking unless prompted. Therapy sessions had failed, and so had the well-meaning interventions of neighbors. Jack, not a man of speeches, simply brought her aboard the St. Mary and told her, "You don't have to talk. Just help me keep this thing afloat." Somehow, that had been enough. The boat chugged through the frigid bay, its engine grumbling as if sharing the weight of its passengers' silence. They weren't out here for fun. Jack made weekly runs to scan the shoreline for illegal fish traps, derelict debris, and stranded wildlife, something between habit and duty. On this particular morning, the sea had a strange smell, rust and rot, sharper than usual. Emma noticed it first, tugging at Jack's sleeve and pointing to a dark shape bobbing among the ice sheets. It was a shipping container, large, rust-covered, barely afloat. The lettering on its side had been eroded by years of salt water and wind. One of its corners had crashed against a floating shelf of ice, lodging it at an angle. Jack cursed under his breath, maneuvered the St. Mary closer, and killed the engine. "Get the rope," he muttered to Emma. She obeyed without hesitation, looping a thick line through the rusted handle of the container while Jack grabbed a crowbar from beneath the deck planks. The sound when the door creaked open was the groan of metal mourning. The stench that followed hit them like a physical blow: salt, excrement, and despair. Emma recoiled and covered her face, but Jack, steeling himself, lifted the door wider, his breath caught in his throat. Inside, lying in a heap on the cold steel floor, were 5 golden retrievers. Their golden coats were dulled with grime and matted with salt. Their ribs jutted like broken piano keys. None of them barked. One lifted its head, blinked slowly, then collapsed again. Another's tail thumped feebly, but one dog stirred more than the others. He was larger than the rest, perhaps 6 years old, his coat the color of sunlit wheat despite the filth. His eyes, amber and deeply human, locked onto Jack's. He did not whine, he did not flinch, slowly, as if each inch cost him dearly. He crawled toward the open door, then, with great care, he extended his neck and licked the back of Jack's hand. "Jesus," Jack whispered, his voice breaking in a way it hadn't in years. Emma, who had been frozen behind him, took a step forward. Her eyes settled on the smallest of the dogs, a young pup, maybe a year old, who barely moved. She dropped to her knees outside the door and reached in. Can I hold this one?" she asked. Her voice the softest Jack had heard since her parents died. Jack blinked in disbelief, but nodded with gentle arms. Emma pulled the young golden against her chest. The pup didn't resist. Instead, he gave the smallest of sighs and rested his head in the crook of her elbow. They worked in silence after that. Jack lifted the dogs one by one into the boat, wrapping them in spare blankets and towels. Emma held the smallest the entire time, whispering things no one else could hear. The large golden Jack would later name him Cooper, stayed close, refusing to let his gaze leave Jack's side. As the boat turned back toward the mainland, the sea swelled around them. The wind picked up, slicing through their coats and whistling between the boat's rails. Jack throttled the engine harder than usual. Jaw clenched. The dogs lay huddled near the engine box, trembling not just from cold, but from something older. Fear baked into bone. "Where the hell did you come from?" Jack muttered, staring back at the half-sunken container drifting farther behind them. Emma was silent, stroking the ears of the pup in her arms. The dog's tail twitched. Cooper watched them both, and somewhere in the deep of that storm-washed bay, the sea began to forget what it had been made to bury. The wind was louder in the mountains, just outside of Homer, Alaska, past the last snow-dusted cabins and broken fences. There lay an abandoned outpost once used by the Coast Guard for Arctic training and radar monitoring. Jack Marlowe knew every beam and crack in the place. It was where he had served as a young officer before his deployment overseas. Now, retired and mostly forgotten, the place had become his retreat, surrounded by pine forests. The crumbling concrete facility sat beneath a sky wide enough to hold secrets and stars alike. Jack drove his rusted Ford pickup along the unmarked trail leading to the outpost, its tires crunching over frozen leaves. The 5 golden retrievers lay nestled beneath wool blankets in the truck bed, still weak but no longer listless. Cooper, the oldest, lay closest to the cab, his honey-gold coat dull but his eyes sharp and always scanning the trees. Jack could feel the dog's gaze even through the back window. Emma sat in the front passenger seat, arms curled tightly around the youngest dog, whom she had started calling Dusty for his perpetually messy fur. She hadn't spoken much since their return from the bay, but there was a subtle change in her posture, less withdrawn, more aware, like someone slowly rediscovering her place in the world. The truck creaked to a halt in front of the outpost's main building, a squat structure with faded red paint and boarded-up windows. Jack climbed out and lifted the tailgate. The dogs stirred as he began gently moving them inside, one by one, into what had once been the communications room. It still had a working generator, a fireplace, and a few salvaged army cots that now served as makeshift beds. Over the next few days, Jack nursed the dogs back to strength. He ground kibble into warm broth, cleaned their wounds with iodine, and even rationed his own supplies to ensure they stayed hydrated. Cooper remained calm through it all, never growling, always watching. It was that intense awareness, the way his ears shifted with each sound, the way he flinched ever so slightly before someone entered the room, That first made Jack suspicious. One morning, as Jack stood outside chopping firewood beneath the slate-gray sky, he caught sight of something through the open window. Emma was playing in the hallway with Dusty, tossing a wool sock down the corridor. The other dogs remained curled in the room, still slow from exhaustion. But Cooper had followed the sock with his eyes. Then he stood and approached Emma with deliberate steps. She raised her hand instinctively, and the dog stopped dead in his tracks, dropping into a crouch. It wasn't fear, it was training. Later that afternoon, Jack decided to test his theory. He stood at the far end of the hallway and held out his hand in a flat, horizontal motion. Fingers closed. Cooper, from a seated position, immediately lowered into a stealth crawl. Another signal. 2 fingers raised and curved slightly, and Cooper dashed forward before halting at Jack's boots. Jack felt a cold wash run down his spine. "These are no ordinary dogs," he muttered to himself. That evening, while Jack repaired a busted lock on the outpost's rear door, Emma sat with Cooper by the fireplace, combing through his matted fur. Her fingers brushed against something hard beneath his collar, nestled beneath a layer of wet wool and faded leather. Curious. She worked the object loose and stared at it, a tiny waterproof capsule. Black. No larger than an AA battery. It had a USB port covered by a rubber seal. "Grandpa," she called, holding the device out. Jack took it carefully. Eyebrows furrowed. His hands trembled slightly as he plugged it into the ancient military-grade laptop still connected to a backup battery inside the comms room. The screen flickered, then came to life. There were only 3 files, all encrypted. Jack, who had once worked counter-intel during the Gulf conflict, recognized the encryption format immediately, military-grade, but not standard. It took him 2 hours and a dusty cipher book to crack the first one. What they saw was enough to silence even the wind. A grainy video played, a sterile warehouse, fluorescent lights, and 5 young golden retrievers lined up inside reinforced kennels, one by one. A man, tall, clean-shaven, wearing tactical black, issued hand signals while the dogs performed precision maneuvers, crawling beneath barbed wire, retrieving dummy explosives, staying motionless under simulated gunfire. They were being trained, not for service, for silence. The footage bore the watermark. Operation Halcyon. Jack sat back, his jaw clenched. This wasn't rescue. He said at last this was disposal. Emma stared at the screen. Her voice was a whisper. Why would someone throw them away before Jack could answer? The second file auto-played. This one was darker. Literally. A nighttime simulation. The dogs, fully grown, were maneuvering through a mock village setup, taking down targets with frightening efficiency. No barking, no hesitation. A voice off camera praised their lack of emotion. Perfect obedience, the man said. No interference from empathy or affection. Jack slammed the laptop shut. He couldn't stop seeing the way Cooper had crawled toward him that first day, weak, dying, but still willing to reach out. That wasn't programming, that was instinct. Or maybe something deeper. They broke their programming, he murmured. Emma sat quietly, hugging Dusty tight. A knock at the door startled them both. Jack reached for the shotgun he kept behind the coat rack, motioning for Emma to stay low. But it wasn't a threat, it was Nina Bradford. 34, an old Coast Guard medic who had once served with Jack. She was tall, with broad shoulders and cropped blonde hair. Her weathered skin hinted at long hours spent on snowmobiles and search and rescue missions, despite her tough exterior. Her eyes softened when she saw the dogs. "Got your signal on the old ham radio," she said. "Thought you might need help." Jack lowered the gun. You still patch up more than people. Nina smirked. Let's just say I have a soft spot for broken things. She set up a temporary medical station in the outpost's mess hall and spent the night checking each dog's vitals. They've been through hell, she said. And not just starvation. Someone taught them to kill, then left them to die. Jack nodded grimly. I think I know who. The wind howled through the pine trees as early winter gripped the Alaskan wilderness in its frozen teeth. Snow had begun to accumulate on the roof of the abandoned Coast Guard outpost, layering its rusted satellite dishes and peeling red walls in silent white. Inside, the warmth of the fire in the communications room did little to thaw the unease that had settled over Jack Marlowe. He stood by the window, Cooper at his side, both of them staring into the dark tree line. Jack had started hearing whispers, not the kind that came from ghosts or grief, but the kind that traveled through old friends and old networks, veterans, informants, off-the-record operators who still owed him favors. The message was clear. Orion Systems, a private military contractor with connections deeper than any official agency, had picked up chatter about recovered assets in Alaska. Leading the retrieval team was a name Jack hadn't expected to hear again. Major Grant Holloway. It struck him like a blunt weapon. Holloway had once been a fellow officer, sharp-minded, clean-cut, and obsessed with tactical innovation. He was a man who believed emotion was a malfunction, especially in animals trained for war. Back then. Jack had served under him briefly in an experimental K-9 division in Afghanistan. He remembered the way Holloway looked at the dogs, not as allies or companions, but as gear, replaceable, disposable. When several dogs died in a training mishap, Jack filed a formal protest. The program was disbanded soon after, and Holloway disappeared from the chain of command. Until now. Jack kept his suspicions quiet. He didn't tell Emma. The girl had finally begun to laugh again, especially around Dusty, the smallest pup, who had started sleeping at her feet every night and licking her awake each morning. Cooper, still recovering, had taken to patrolling the hallways at night. Sometimes Jack would wake to find him sitting alert at the foot of his bed, watching the door like a sentinel born for war. The night it happened. The snow had stopped falling. The sky was moonless. The wind had quieted, and the outpost felt suspended in breathless anticipation. Jack had taken the late shift again. Pacing near the front entrance, checking the perimeter, he noticed it first, a red light blinking where it shouldn't have been. A motion sensor trip, hidden in the trees, he whispered. We've got company, and moved quickly, locking down the hallway doors and grabbing the old service revolver he kept stashed beneath the radio desk. The first figure came through a broken window in the tool room, black fatigues, face obscured by a visor, steps unnaturally silent. Behind him, two more slipped through the back door, disabling the hinges with practiced ease. These weren't amateurs, they were retrieval, but they hadn't expected the dogs. Cooper let out a single bark, a command. Instantly, the rest of the pack moved. Ghost disappeared into shadow. Sasha crouched low near the hall's far end. Bear positioned himself at the main stairwell like a living wall. Bolt, though young, was already trained by necessity. He took position near the exit, ready to flank. Emma, woken by the noise, opened the bunkroom door just as a fourth intruder emerged from the far corridor. He grabbed her with one swift movement and began dragging her backward. She struggled, kicking and screaming, but the man was strong, fast, and calculating. He didn't count on Cooper from across the hall. Cooper launched himself forward, a golden blur through shadow. He struck the man square in the chest, teeth finding flesh beneath gear. The assailant dropped Emma, who scrambled free just as Jack rounded the corner with his pistol raised. "Stand down," Jack yelled, but the man vanished through the same window he entered from, Cooper limping behind him, blood marking the floor in a splattered trail. Jack caught Emma in his arms. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, still trembling. "Cooper, he's bleeding." Jack turned to see the dog collapse near the fireplace, panting hard. Blood darkened the golden fur at his shoulder. Sasha and Bear moved quickly to form a protective half-circle around him, while Ghost slinked to the shadows again, ears twitching for any remaining threat. The invaders had vanished. No shots were fired, no orders spoken, just in and out. Hours later, after stitching Cooper's wound and settling Emma back in bed, Jack opened an old metal footlocker from the supply room. Inside were photos, mission documents, and a personnel roster from 2011. He found it. Unit 7, Tactical K-9 Division. There was his name, and beneath it, Major Grant Holloway, commanding officer. He stared at the picture, his younger self in uniform, standing stiff beside Holloway and 4 leashed dogs. Jack remembered those dogs, loyal, brave, and he remembered what happened to them when they failed to meet standards. It wasn't just coincidence Holloway had come to collect Cooper and the others. It was unfinished business. The morning sun cast pale streaks through the fog blanketing the foothills above Homer, Alaska, from the hilltop where the outpost stood. The coastline below looked like a watercolor painting, soft, cold, unfinished, inside the aging communications room. Jack Marlowe stood before a dusty corkboard now pinned with military records, faded photographs, and scribbled timelines. His fingers hovered over a grainy printout of the Halcyon unit's final report. The name Marlowe. J, circled in red ink. It was a vote. His vote, the lone no that had been ignored. He'd opposed the final stage of the Halcyon project, refused to sign off on what Holloway had called Loyalty Automation Protocol. Jack had warned the brass, "You can teach a dog to follow. You can't force it to love now, over a decade later." He stood in a room with 5 dogs who had been trained to follow without question. And yet, when the moment came, they had chosen to protect. They had fought not for reward or command, but for each other. And for Emma. Jack leaned down and scratched Cooper behind the ears. The wound on the dog's side was healing slowly, a pink line beneath the golden fur. Cooper didn't flinch. His eyes stayed fixed on Jack's. "We were right," Jack said aloud. "They broke the damn system." That afternoon, Jack powered up the old satellite uplink that Nina had reconnected. He typed a secure message to an old friend, Daniel Whitaker, a war journalist now working freelance. Daniel was in his early 50s, African American, stout with a neatly trimmed beard and a voice made for narration, once a celebrated embedded reporter. Daniel had gone independent after losing his brother, also a journalist, in a friendly fire cover-up during a campaign in Syria. Since then, he had chased down the kinds of stories most networks wouldn't touch. Jack's message was simple. "You were right about Halcyon. I have the proof." And they came for it. "Within 12 hours, Daniel replied. "I'm flying in. Keep them safe." Meanwhile, Emma was busy with her own mission after the break-in. Jack had taken her to town for the first time in weeks. She had walked beside him through the snow-covered streets of Homer, her small gloved hand holding Dusty's leash as they entered the local co-op grocery. At first, the townspeople only glanced at her, an older man and his granddaughter with a well-behaved golden pup. But by the time they left, whispers had begun. Back at the outpost, Emma sat at the worn kitchen table with a group of local kids, neighbors' grandkids, homeschooled teens who had known her before the accident. Among them was Rosie Clark, 12, plump and full of nervous energy, and Leo Granger, 11, a quiet boy who rarely spoke but drew vivid, haunting pictures. Emma had invited them after telling a simplified version of the truth. The dogs were soldiers, but they were betrayed. They chose not to hurt anyone. They chose to be good. It was Rosie who came up with the name. We should call it the Golden Pact, she said, like a promise they made, and we'll tell everyone. So they did. The kids took photos with the dogs, made TikToks of Dusty licking Emma's face, drew comics of Cooper fighting off shadows, wrote posts under Shocker Golden Pact. Within 48 hours. The story had spread. At first, only locals followed it, then former veterans, animal rights pages, and soon, national accounts. One viral post showed Bolt and Ghost flanking a laughing Emma. Captioned, they were trained to be weapons, but they chose to be protectors. Jack, meanwhile, prepared the evidence. He and Nina compiled the footage from the capsule Emma had found in Cooper's collar. They included medical records, satellite imagery of a remote compound in South America, and a decrypted personnel list with Holloway's name. Daniel arrived on the 4th day, rugged coat. Camera slung across his shoulder. Breath fogging in the mountain air. He hugged Jack tightly. God, it's been too long, Daniel said, then, seeing the dogs, especially Cooper limping toward him. He paused. They look like they've seen more war than I have. Jack nodded. They have. Daniel spent 2 days filming interviews. Jack by the fire explaining Halcyon's mission. Emma talking softly beside Sasha. Nina describing the surgical scars on the dog's flanks and their resilience. He recorded Bolt chasing snowflakes, Bear dozing beside the generator, and Cooper watching the sunset in absolute stillness. This isn't just a story, Daniel whispered that night as they stood on the porch, camera beside him. This is a reckoning. By the time he flew back to the lower 48, the footage was encrypted in 2 drives and uploaded to 3 separate cloud servers. Within a week. The video titled They Chose Love. The truth behind the Golden Pact premiered across independent channels and watchdog networks. Within 24 hours. It had over 2 million views. Donations flooded in, not for Jack, but for legal investigations into military animal treatment. Former employees of Orion Systems began speaking out. A Senate subcommittee called for hearings. But none of that mattered to Jack as much as the moment he saw Emma holding Dusty beside Leo and Rosie. All 3 of them beaming in the snow as Ghost circled protectively. It was not the noise that mattered. It was the change, small, quiet, real. They had told the truth. Snow fell like a prophecy the night they came, thick. Heavy flakes muffled the world in an eerie silence, cloaking the trees around the outpost in layers of white so dense they seemed sculpted from marble. Jack Marlowe stood beneath the skeletal branches of a black spruce, his breath fogging as he adjusted the scope on his old bolt-action rifle. Cooper sat beside him. Fully healed now, the faint pink scar on his shoulder barely visible beneath a clean, brushed coat of gold. The other dogs fanned out in a loose half-circle. Bear to the left, crouched low and still as stone. Ghost, a shadow in the trees, Sasha near the outpost's edge, and Bolt, watching from above on a rocky ledge. Jack had spent the last week preparing the land for war. He rigged non-lethal traps, flares, perimeter alarms, smoke screens, and dug shallow trenches with Emma's help. He didn't want blood, but he wasn't going to let them take what had finally found peace. He knew Holloway would return. The broadcast of the Golden Pact had pushed things too far. The Senate hearings had begun, and former Halcyon staff were testifying. Flipping on their old commander, Orion Systems had gone silent, and that silence meant only one thing: cleanup, quiet, final. They would come for the dogs, or try to. The first flare went off at 3:14 a.m., casting red light over the snowy hillside. Jack didn't flinch. He raised his rifle, peered through the scope, and saw them, 6 figures moving in tandem, dressed in snow camo, helmets fitted with infrared visors, professional, but not invincible. He gave one short whistle. Cooper vanished into the trees, inside the outpost. Emma lay awake, clutching Dusty in her arms. Though Jack had wanted to send her to safety, she'd refused. "This is their home," she had said, "and mine, now." She waited in the safest room, reinforced walls, one exit, lined with signal flares and a shortwave radio. Nina stood outside the door, armed with a tranquilizer rifle. "You shoot only if I say," Jack had told her. She had nodded, calm as always, her blonde hair tied back, eyes sharp beneath her wool cap. Outside, the forest exploded into movement. Ghost was the first to engage, slipping behind 2 of the mercenaries, tripping them with precision. Bear charged next, a blur of muscle and snow, knocking one to the ground and pinning him beneath a tree limb. Smoke bombs went off near the perimeter, obscuring vision, forcing the attackers into confusion. Jack moved quickly, flanking left toward the frozen creek. One of the men tried to intercept, but Bolt streaked down from his perch like lightning, barreling into the man's legs and disarming him with a single twist. Through it all, Cooper led, darting from tree to tree, coordinating with the others as though born to command. The dogs didn't kill. They didn't maim. But they fought with the fury of animals who knew this wasn't survival. It was choice. Then came the voice, cutting through the crackling snow. "Stand down, Marlowe." Jack turned. Slowly. Holloway stood a dozen paces away. The years hadn't changed him much. Tall, stiff-shouldered, his face clean-shaven, eyes the same sharp gray. But his uniform was different now. No rank insignia, no flag. Just a cold black coat with a private emblem on the shoulder, Orion. Jack kept his rifle lowered. "It's over." "Holloway, you made it over." The man replied, "I never left," behind him. Sasha appeared, growling low. Her eyes flicked to Jack, awaiting permission. Jack gave a slight shake of his head. "Not yet." "I don't want to kill them," Holloway said. "I just want them returned to protocol. They made their choice." Jack said, "You don't get to take that away. They're not yours." Holloway hissed. "No." Jack agreed. "They're family." And then Cooper stepped into view. He didn't growl. He didn't bare his teeth. He simply stood between the 2 men, looking straight at Holloway with eyes that held the weight of everything he'd endured. Something flickered in Holloway's face. Doubt, regret. No, just cold calculation. He reached slowly for the holster at his hip. The crack of the shot wasn't from Jack's rifle. It was a tranquilizer, fired clean from Nina's position. Holloway staggered, eyes wide, knees buckling. He crumpled into the snow like a dropped flag. They tied his hands, called it in, and by dawn, a federal marshal helicopter had landed in the clearing. Holloway was placed into custody, unconscious and silent. 2 of his men were arrested. The rest fled into the trees when it was done. Emma stepped out of the outpost, Dusty at her side. The dogs gathered around her as if pulled by gravity. Jack stood behind her, his heart heavy, his shoulders finally relaxing for the first time in months. Later that week, the Senate announced a full investigation into Operation Halcyon. Orion Systems was suspended. Witnesses came forward. The public demanded reform. But none of that mattered in the small town of Homer, where things had changed forever. The townspeople began visiting the outpost. They brought gifts, blankets, dog food, even framed drawings. Emma's story had become their story. Kids came to see the Golden Pack, and older veterans came to sit quietly beside Cooper, as if sharing a moment no one else could understand. Jack officially adopted all 5 dogs. The paperwork was simple, the bond far older. Emma returned to school, no longer afraid of being different. She gave a speech to her class, standing in front of 20 curious faces, Dusty at her feet. They were trained to be something they weren't. She said, but they chose to be who they are. We all get to do that. Jack began writing again, not field reports, a memoir, he called it. They chose us, and in the evenings, beneath the pine trees, heavy with snow, the pack would run, free, whole, home at last. Sometimes, miracles do not come in the form of thunder or burning bushes. Sometimes they come on 4 legs, with golden fur and eyes that choose love even after a world has taught them fear. The Golden Pack reminded us that loyalty cannot be programmed, and that no matter how broken something seems, it can be healed through compassion, choice, and faith. Maybe it was chance that Jack found them. Maybe it was strategy, but maybe it was God's way of reminding us that redemption is always possible. Even for those abandoned, misunderstood, or labeled damaged, these dogs chose to protect, to trust, and to love. That was their miracle. And perhaps that's the miracle we all need to believe in again. So, if this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Leave a comment about what moment moved you most. And subscribe for more stories that prove the light is still out there. And if you believe, like we do, that love and loyalty are divine gifts, type Amen in the comments and pray for all those still waiting to be chosen, whether 2-legged or 4. May God bless you and your family.